Awesome. Okay, well, hi everyone, and welcome to another Sydney BE meetup that Will and I co-host. Firstly, I just want to give a shout out to UTS Futures Academy for helping us host all of these sessions. We're very appreciative of all of the support you give us. So thank you, Julia. Very excited because tonight we're joined by one of the best in the business, Samuel Salzer. Samuel is a leading behavioral design expert and author. He specializes in helping value-driven organizations apply behavioral science to build user-centered and habit-forming products and services. He also helped build the first behavioral agency in Sweden and is currently senior advisor of behavioral science at Doconomy and Kilo.Health. And as many of you may know already, he's also the founder of Habit Weekly, which I personally am a massive fan of. And if you haven't checked it out, I definitely recommend doing so and subscribing. So tonight, Samuel is going to take us through why habits are hard to change, the science behind how to change them, and the 3 most common mistakes made when creating scalable habit-forming solutions. Type your questions in the chat as we go along, and Will run the Q&A at the end. So without further ado, over to you, Samuel.
Thank you so much. Really great to be here. I'm just going to bring up my screen here as well. This is visible. You can see my screen. Very good. Yeah, so very happy to be here currently in Stockholm. So I assume a lot of people on the call are in Australia, so good evening. And I think that was pretty well covered introduction. I don't know if there's anything more I need to say, but again, my background and passion is really thinking about how we can change behavior when change is difficult. So when we're trying to think about long-term behavior changes in areas like health or sustainability, where we know that there's a high intention, but maybe an intention that doesn't always become a habit. And so today, my personal intention is to provide some hopefully thoughtful insights on how to think about habits, because it's such an commonly referred to term, especially within applied behavioral science, but also beyond. And I think we can probably become a little more well-versed and well understanding of what it means to change habits and how to understand the science behind them as well. So my agenda, as was mentioned, I'm going to set the scene a little bit. I'm going to dive into a little bit of science of habits. And there was a little planning fallacy between me writing the description for the talk and actually putting together the talk, because I realized it's so much I wanted to say that I don't think I will have time for three common fields, so probably be 2. For the Q&A, maybe I can share some more things there. But yeah, that's the plan. So let's get going. So why am I here today? Why do I want to talk about this? Well, I think in general, as I mentioned, habit as a phenomena started in many ways long time ago. Like we talked about habits in some ways, even in research in some ways for a long time. And one of the original books is a book called Habit by William James. And if you don't know William James, he's truly one of the most interesting, thoughtful thinkers way before his time. So a lot of the things that he said in the 1890s is still kind of thought about today as truths and reliable insights. So maybe he was having some very reliable gut feeling of things or good observation, but certainly a lot of things he said has proved to be quite accurate. But a lot has happened since he published this little book, and today we have a world where everyone wants to build habits. We have habits has become not only powerful, but then they became tiny, and then they became atomic. So that a lot of things has happened in the world of habits, and it's a very common phrase to hear about that. You know, my life is good, but if I only could build better habits, it would be a little bit better. And so, generally for me, it's such an interesting concept. And one of the things that you probably have already seen if you're interested in applied behavioral science is this idea of intention action gap. I already referred to it before. And it's one of these recurring things you have to especially remind people that maybe aren't applied behavioral scientists that, hey, just because someone says they have an intention to do it doesn't mean they will do it. And that's a big gap. The intention action gap is pretty big. Consider then the intention habit gap. We're going to get into definition in a moment, but intentions leading to action is a big gap. But then for that to become a habit, it needs to be repeated over and over and over and over again. So it sounds like a really wonderful idea to be like, okay, if I can only have some more habits in my life, wouldn't that be wonderful? Of course. But I think we have a very, in general, straw man or very limited understanding of what it actually means or how to think about it. And so what's problematic as well is that when we look at habit forming apps, they are pretty terrible. So one research paper looking at 115 of them tried to see like what features do they use and how well do those features lead to likelihood of habit formation happening. And as can be seen, there's quite a few features that are actually likely habit forming. And you end up, when looking at a lot of this research, seeing that the apps that are supposed to help us are sometimes the most terrible at actually building habits. They're kind of glorified to-do lists, and even apps that are more actively trying to support our behavior change in health or in other domains also fails to really use the science of habit formation in a thoughtful way. So I think this is something that many people can relate to when they read a book or they start engaging in a habit forming app or similar, is that they get stuck. They feel like they're waiting for these habits to form, but this magical eureka moment never really sets in. And so let's get into a little more of how I think about the science of habit change. There's a lot of things to cover here, so I will cover some of the things that I think is perhaps less well understood. But the basic gist here, as you probably already alluded to, is that it's difficult to create lasting change, and it's a tricky conundrum. I think a lot of people here might be dealing with a lot of these situations where you might work in financial services or health or other areas where people again have these good intentions, but you're probably noticing with your products and services that it's tricky. It's tricky to get them to engage and kind of convert this good intention into a good habit. And there's so many factors that kind of influences behavior change. This is just a screenshot from, I think, one of the lessons at bside.org. We have some more material there as well. But I think it just illustrates that when we're thinking about the components involved in influencing habit formation or just behavior change in general, there's so much there. There's so many variables, and it can be easily overwhelming to think about. So with that being said, we know that it's hard to do now. Okay, actually I had one more meme here. I forgot about this one. So yeah, hopefully this was not a spoiler alert or spoiler for anyone here. You probably will experience this firsthand, that behavior change is really complicated. But yeah, so let's get into some definitions and how to think a little bit better about habits in itself. So there's actually not really a lot of clear agreement on the exact definition of habits within the habit research domain. There are obviously a lot of overlaps in various definitions, but there are arguments for various things that they can be seen as a habit or habitual behavior. And to kind of have an overview of what most definitions have in common, and a good thing to start with, think about, is that habit is a form of engaging with the behavior when you're engaging as very automatic way. So it's when a behavior is done in a very automatic, non-conscious fashion, and in forms where we repeat said behavior over and over again. We get some form of experience reward for doing this, and we do it in a stable context which supports us to remember it. So let's get into some of those details a little bit further to give some more nuance here. What do we mean? So repetition, that one is relatively straightforward, where we know that in order to create further automaticity, it's repetition is kind of the name of the game. We have to repeat it over and over again. And frequency repetition is sometimes a little bit overlooked. We think maybe about days, but repetitions are really important to consider. Another thing that's oftentimes misunderstood is rewards. So you often hear about the idea of rewards, but that makes you probably think about something like a carrot or something that you add to after having done the behavior, you get this trophy. However, it just needs to be some form of positive consequence. And that can either come from a, let's say, positive emotion, like you feel happy, you feel have some form of positive emotional experience, but it can also be removing some form of negative state, internal state, like a negative thing like anxiety or boredom, for example. So when we say reward, we can think about it in various ways, but there's a lot of nuance there, and habits can form not only through attaching some form of just like here's a candy after you did a sit-up, for example. It can be much more nuanced, and oftentimes what people miss is that idea of that habits often forms very strongly when there's a really effective way of removing some painful thing. So like boredom, for example. Hence social media addiction in many ways. So last thing I was going to say is stable context. So what we mean here is that when we're doing those repetitions and when we're having some positive consequence from them, that leads us to wanting to repeat them. But it might not lead them to becoming fully kind of automatic or non-conscious in the sense that they might still require some conscious thought to decide if they should be done or how they should be done and so on. And one of the big factors that determines whether it actually becomes more habitual is the stable context. And so what we mean here is that there needs to be some stability in place, time, past behavior that kind of remains across repetitions. It's a little bit like you know that if you sit down in a car, you will automatically kind of look for the seatbelt, hopefully. And that's always going to happen when you sit in a car, but it doesn't happen when you sit in a computer chair. So the context of being in a car, even though you're sitting there, as the same as you're doing with a computer chair, the car makes a big difference. The context of being in a car makes you automatically associate sitting down with then putting on your seatbelt. So that's really, really important. So then I think we have covered the basic gist. Again, the Q&A is a great place for diving deeper here if you have any further questions or thoughts on these components, for example, or other components. But that's the basics. And I think it sets kind of a foundation, but let's not stop there. Let's continue to peel down or peel back the layers. And three things I really wanted to dig into further is common misconceptions. So first thing I'm going to talk about is this idea of time to form a habit. How long does it take? Second, how to measure habit formation. We kind of very laissez-faire talk about habits being formed, but what does it actually mean? And how do we know when a habit has become a habit, for example? And then thirdly, should we maybe be wary of certain models around trying to explain habit formation if they're too simple and maybe provide too much of a simplistic view? First thing first, it doesn't take 21 days. If you heard that it takes 21 days to form a habit, that just comes from a surgeon, a cosmetic surgeon from the US, I think from the 1960s, where he observed that his patient took about 21 days to recover from their facial reconstruction or something. And he, theorized that maybe that's true for all things. Maybe it takes 21 days to get used to new behaviors and form habits as well. So he wrote a very popular book. And sadly, that's why a lot of people think that's the case. There's been some research trying to attempt to get to this answer. And the best study is one was done by Lally et al. In 2010. The problem with the study is that it looks at a lot of different behaviors. And while it says that it takes on average 66 days, the range is from 18 days to I think 265 or 67 days. And the behaviors they looked at was everything from flossing a tooth and drinking water to going to the gym. And it wasn't the biggest sample as well. So it's not the most reliable thing. And perhaps more importantly, should we even ask this question? Should we say that how many days does it form habit? Maybe it's somewhat misinformed. Because if you think about someone who wants to read, or you have two people who wants to read, one person decides that I'm going to read every weekday at lunchtime. The second person says, I'm going to read for 2 hours on Sundays. So they might read the same amount of time every week, let's say 2 hours, but the first person has 5 repetitions a week versus the second person having 1 repetition. So, within 10 weeks, you have one person having 50 repetitions versus one person having 10 repetitions. And so when it comes to habits, that matters because repetitions is again connected to habit formation. So it's not like you can just repeat something a million times in one day and then it's going to be habitual, but to a certain degree, that's true. Obviously, there is a very complex dimension where obviously days is required as well to help our memory form and so on and make changes to our brain. But again, repetitions is kind of an overlooked dimension. And so while it can be nice to think about, okay, approximately how many days would it take for me? Better thing to probably consider is how can I ensure that I have frequent repetitions in a stable context? And how can I think about complexity of the behavior as well? Because obviously, if it's something like drinking water in the morning versus going to the gym, there's huge variability there in complexity. And so you can imagine that's going to lead to a very difficult, different, outcome in terms of how long it takes. So when someone asks you, like, how many days does it take to form a habit, be a little bit wary of saying, like, it takes X amount of days, because we often say it depends in behavioral science, but this might be one of the cases where it depends more than others. I was going to talk about habit formation being difficult to measure, but as it was put together in this slide, I felt bad because there's a lot of information overload. So I will make this whole slide deck available afterwards for, I think, at least 48 hours or 72 hours. And also you have the recording from this talk. So I won't show this slide because so much information, but I just summarize and say that there are some really thoughtful ways of trying to measure habits. And it's either being done through some form of self-reporting, where there's some form of trying to gauge the level of automaticity from how people experience doing the behavior. Or there's ways of trying to observe and see how quickly someone, for example, responds to a cue in a specific context. The second one is more reliable, but it can be harder to do. So this is something very interesting, because how do you measure something that per definition happens automatically for people? And this is the challenge here. Like, it's quite hard. It's one of the difficult things to really measure. We can measure behavior happens, but knowing for sure that it's habitual is, again, easier said than done. And especially on digital products, it's really hard to know. It's really, really hard to know to what degree a behavior is actually habitual. And so you have to make some form of inferences based on when they do it, the frequency of engaging, like from a notification to actually engaging with the app, and then doing that on a regular basis, and maybe even going into the app after having stopped receiving notifications on the same time, for example. Then you could see that probably there's a high likelihood of being habitual. But where one comes here is that the problem is that we rarely even try to do this. We say something is habitual without actually thinking about how do we measure that, or how do we even try to create a proxy for measuring this. And I think a good example comes from something I came across recently. So I really love this book. It's a fantastic book on kind of how to think about behavior change in our everyday lives by Katie Milkman, called How to Change. And one thing, though, that stuck out for me is that in the chapter on laziness, she has this conclusion in the chapter saying that too much rigidity is the enemy of a good habit. by allowing for flexibility in your routines, you'll build stickier, more lasting habits. And I was like, wow, this is really interesting, because the whole literature pretty much says the opposite. And it's really interesting when you see something that maybe contradicts what's currently believed. And it becomes very interesting then to see why is this said, and what was the background around this. And it seems that this bases on a research paper that was co-authored by the author as well. And it looked at kind of this idea of flexibility versus routinization. But what they did here, to set the scene, is that they had four set of groups actually. And in one criteria, they had a fixed and one a more flexible routine for having, okay, let's see how I explain this. In one set, people were asked to set a 2-hour window where they're going to exercise for the next 4 weeks. In the other set, they did not need to put that in. And then they split each again to give them either $3 or $7 if they exercised. So 2 main groups and then 2 subgroups within each. And so pretty much what I want to see is that, okay, how big of a difference does a $3 versus $7 incentive make for getting people to exercise? And secondly, how big of a difference does, in their definition, consistency, having pre-selected 2-hour window, versus flexibility, exercising whenever? And they came to some conclusions, and they claim that the flexibility group slightly outperformed both during the 4-week intervention and the 8-week post-intervention period. And so especially for the first of those 4 weeks. And so they pretty much then make this claim that we think that flexibility is really important, and consistency maybe is overrated. We should have a little bit of both for habits to form. And this is where I think there's some interesting things to learn from. So one thing is that obviously this study relied on financial incentives. So we should be aware that that's a big component here. So while it measures habit formation, we know that financial incentives can kind of have a lot of unintended consequences and crowd out intrinsic motivations and so on as well if gone wrong. So that's just something to note. Second thing that I just noticed straight away, which actually was mentioned as well in the limitations at the end of the paper, was this idea of giving people a pre-selected 2-hour window that they had to set. And I thought about myself. If I was asked to decide, okay, for the next 4 weeks, I'm going to work out on days only within this 2-hour window, I would probably struggle with finding out like which is the best 2-hour window for me. And I would probably quickly find that maybe I chosen the wrong 2-hour window, and it's actually terrible for me, but then it's too late to change. And so I don't really get paid if I work out anywhere else during the day. So I might just not work out at all because it's just that 2-hour window that's selected. So in a way, it doesn't really try to understand consistency in the real sense of what we're usually thinking about in habit formation, but a very limited or very narrow form of consistency. And more interestingly, perhaps as well, is when we look at their data, we see a curve going down very sharply. And so on the left here, we see that on average number of workouts being done by participants in the 2 groups. And then on this, we have the weeks, the 4 weeks where the intervention happened, and the 8 weeks after the intervention where they measured the kind of results from the intervention. And we see here like a pretty sharp downturn. So people go to the gym initially about 2 days a week, and then they end up after 12 weeks down to half a day on average among the participants, which is not really surprising. We know that people struggle with getting into a gym routine or habit. But when I looked at this, I was just curious, how do they know that there was actually any habits formed within this? And interestingly, there wasn't really any, as far as I could tell, reliable measures that they had for habits forming. And what it seemed to be is more of a general approach of thinking that if people go to the gym, they probably have a habit of going to the gym. But again, going back to what I mentioned before, we can't really assume that a behavior being repeated is habitual just because it's done. There's so many variables that can be measured to try to better understand if it's habitual or not. But it should be a pretty strong claim to make that, okay, we have helped people form gym habits by engaging like more flexible thinking. That should be something that should be a little more, I think, regularly evidenced against. And so hopefully this is a good example to showcase that, first of all, measurement is important, but also it's hard sometimes to measure. And thinking about habit formation in practice can be very messy. So I'm in no way blaming these researchers. I know that it's very hard to measure habit formation, but I think it's a good case study of maybe how we sometimes kind of lose track of what we actually mean when we say habits are forming. And the last thing I'll say about something that's often misunderstood is simplified models. And maybe you recognize some of these. And when we often see habit formation being talked about, including by myself, I'm the first one to admit that I often talk about habit formation sometimes in this way because it's very tempting. We talk about it as requiring some form of trigger, some form of action, and some form of reward. So it goes into the definition earlier, but oftentimes there's a fine line where this is a way to communicate a concept to help making it easily understood, but it can also fall into a very oversimplistic view of what it makes to form a habit. And the idea of a habit loop, for example, might not be as easy as it seems. So a lot of people, I think, when engaging with reading a book, for example, on these topics, might feel like some of this stuff is pretty straightforward, pretty easy. But it is very complicated. If nothing else, I hope that that's one of the takeaways a little bit from this presentation. And in some ways, one way I think we should be honest when we talk about these loops in a way is that they are very much pigeon loops. And what I mean by that is where they come from is literally starting pigeons in boxes. And so when you have a pigeon in a box, it's quite easy to isolate a cue, action, and reward. And you see that if you modify the cue or if you modify the reward, that's going to, in turn, kind of make the action be different. And so within the box, with the pigeon, that can seem like a very straightforward way of supporting habit formation, for example, or modifying behavior. But we know that behavior is very, very complex, and the world is very, very complex. And so what I often see when people in practice, especially organizations or apps, trying to build habits purely using these kind of models, they kind of lose sense or lose track of what actually happens, where there's so many different components being at play here. And there's so many variation of theories that could be considered to understand each of all of these, from reward to action to cue. That's a very, 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 very small sliver of things to consider when we think about designing for habit formation, for example. So much that kind of leaves the table or is not in focus. And so Wendy Wood recently tweeted this, and I think there's some probably truth to this. I think she is frustrated with the idea that people can misconstrue the idea that a reward becomes a cue when you see it as a loop. I'm not sure how many people see it that way, or if you see it that idea of repeating something over and over again makes it habitual. Either way, I do sympathize with this, and I think it's something that the field of applied behavioral science can further think about how we communicate these more complex ideas to make them understood, but maybe don't make them seem overly simplistic, overly easy, that to form a habit, we just have to tick these 2-3 boxes and then we're done. So yeah, what's often misunderstood is that time to form a habit is really dependent on frequency and on complexity. Habit formation is difficult to measure, so be skeptical of claims without solid evidence of saying like, we have this fantastic habit forming solution, for example. What do they mean by that? How do they measure this, and so on? And then lastly, habit formation is much more complex than most models suggest. So just have that as kind of at the back of your head when you're engaging with trying to design for habit formation. Don't maybe look at the most simple model and think that that's the answer. Take a step back, be humble, and do the things that we're taught to do as applied behavioral scientists to do. So that's kind of the first part. I'm going to check time here. Okay, running away with time. I'm going to go through 2 common fails as well that I see when designing for habit formation. And the first one, I will let you actually do a little quick vote in the chat on. So now you have 4 options. You can either say that habit is best predicted by the behavior being easy, the environment being supportive, the built-in social environment, the behavior being repeated in constant context, or there's high motivation in place by the person doing the behavior. If you could have one of these 4 things as the best predictor, which one would you choose? You have about 20 seconds maybe to vote in the chat box. Okay, I'm seeing some results come in here. Interesting. I would say, I think it's a fairly even spread. Initially a lot of 2s, but then quite a lot of 1s and 4s as well, a couple of 3s. And so the good news here is that all of you are correct in a way. It's hard to make a complete definitive answer saying that one of these is better than the other. One research paper I was going to reference here suggests that all of those 4 things are the 4 things that we can often see as being very high correlative to habit formation. But as this research paper shows, and as many other in the habit world of research shows, consistency is over and over again the most important thing. So just forgetting this, it's easier to focus on so many other things, whereas maybe the lowest hanging fruit is, as the authors say, is that they suggest that how rather than why one practice may be more important to forming habits. So just ensuring that people do something in a consistent way, they know what to do, they do it in the same time or place. So just having that basic stuff covered might actually be the most impactful thing as well. And that's why, for example, if you look at Swedish people on Fridays, a lot of people in Sweden eat tacos. If you came here as a foreigner or an alien, you'd be very perplexed. Why do Swedish people eat tacos on Friday? Well, it's because this long-standing campaign from one of the big grocery stores in Sweden has advocated for this idea that it's really nice to have tacos on Fridays. And over time, people have really adopted it and run with it. And now it's a thing. We have tacos on Fridays. And in the US, you have tacos on Tuesdays if you're in the US. Taco Tuesday. And this is a good example of like how it's quite easy then for people to attach a behavior to a day, as in with tacos on Fridays or tacos on Tuesdays. It'd be much more ineffective advertising campaign if the grocery store said, eat tacos twice a week, for example, or eat tacos sometimes on Wednesdays, sometimes on Thursdays, and so on. So just having that really clear consistency in some form of context can really make a really make a big difference. And I noticed this when I was using Duolingo. I had a 200-day streak, but I was still failing. I still got these blue things, which indicates that I had missed a day, but I've saved my streak with a streak freeze. And I wondered why. Why have I not built a habit? It's been 200 days. And looking back, I realized that it will never help me to ensure that I repeat my learning of language at the same time at the same during the day. So sometimes I did it in the morning, sometimes on where I work, sometimes in the afternoon, and so on. And so I never really supported my brain to just wake up and do, or at lunch just do. Instead, I had to think, when should I do it? Should I do it here, there, and so on. And if you want to nerd in on more of this, implementation intentions have so much research supporting this idea, where helping people define what to take, what to do rather, and when and where to do it makes a huge difference. And so when you look at something like I call a habit statement, in terms of you have someone who wants to build a new habit, and you ask them, okay, what is your habit statement? And they say, I want to allow myself space to meditate during the day. Very common New Year's resolution, looking something like this. Comparing that to someone who says, I will meditate using Headspace on weekdays at 12 for 10 minutes, when is my lunch break? This seems like maybe someone is going overboard, and maybe a little bit too much details. You can keep it even simpler, but you can easily see that this one is probably more likely to form a meditation habit than this person. Purely by this idea of having a strong implementation intention. So that's really underrated, really underrated when trying to support habit formation, also in digital apps, to forget to support people in really creating these form of implementation intentions for their behavior change. And so when you fail to build a stable context, you might have to resort to some of these things that Duolingo does instead, which creates memes and stuff like this, which is pretty funny. I think there's an owl there in the background. I don't know if you see it with a knife. So don't be Duolingo here. Like, be the ones that support users in creating good implementation intentions. Breaking news, you're going to fail. So when you're trying to change behavior, there's going to be fails. There's going to be times where the intended action doesn't happen, or, X, Y, and Z. There's so many things that can go wrong, right? And at the same time, no one enjoys feeling incompetent, stupid, or confused. It's one of the things we probably struggle the most with, is dealing with the feeling of not feeling good enough, not feeling like we're performing as way we want to or should. And I add this TM here in jest. I don't have a trademark here, but I often talk about this idea in general about an onboarding, step to solution versus steps to stupid, where I ask an app, how many, like if you look at it, how many steps does it take for your user to feel like they have some form of solution to their problem, some form of solution, versus how many steps engaging with your app does it make them feel stupid? And sadly, for the most part, there's really often the case that there's shorter steps to feeling stupid than having steps to solution. And so that's a big problem in itself. But then if they feel stupid, if they feel like they failed, how is that being dealt with? Because we also know that this is also not very scientific graph. It's more thrown together for this presentation. But as you can see, motivation generally goes down. Habituation takes a long time to build. So what do you do when you kind of lose motivation and habituation haven't set in yet? Really common problem. So we need to think a little bit more about that problem, in short. So even if we had a streak, that is often inevitable. With poorly designed streaks, that might make people feel even more like they failed and completely stop using the app forever, because they feel like, okay, like the what the hell effect, like I've already failed, I might as well just quit. And it's problematic because people associate the habit to the streak. And so when the streak is broken, the habit still might have been developed and going pretty close to becoming finally developed. But because the streak is broken, they think that the habit's also broken. And so it has a lot of problematic areas for that reason. And so how do we ensure that people don't follow the loop, that they don't feel like they're failures and they need to quit? Well, in short, there's no one problem, or sorry, no one solution. But one way I had a fun experience working with this and there's more information within Behavior Lab on this specific case study, was working with LifeSum, which is a app supporting people to eat differently, to change their food behaviors. And for them, they wanted to kind of launch this new plan to promote kind of as a stepping board to longer plans, kind of helping people form better food habits under the Trojan horse of like a little bit sounding like maybe this 3-week weight loss kind of thing, but actually it wouldn't be very dramatic. It would be like slightly reducing calorie consumption while trying to get people to really get into some good habits in those 3 weeks. And one thing that was done here to support pretty much this thing is that a lot of people felt bad when they didn't eat what they're supposed to do. And so here, cheat meals were introduced and actually had a really significant effect. So just adding this option of selecting a thing as a cheat meal, that promoted people to feel less bad when they sometimes maybe slipped and ate a pizza. Because we're humans, it's unrealistic that we should be perfect 24/7. And so when you make that the goal, it's easy to feel like a failure. So here, initially, people get introduced to the idea that you have some of these things you can use. So worst case scenario, don't worry about feeling bad, just use these instead. And compared to the previous plans, this actually had a really good effects. It's about 2x their retention, both in the short term, 3 weeks, but also six months retention. So really positive effects. And so that's just an example to get you to think, but there's so many things we can do to support users in maintaining and recovering progress and not feeling like they failed. Yeah. So yeah, that's fail number 2, ignoring failure states. And that's pretty much it. I feel like we're pretty much getting to Q&A time. So just to wrap up, remember that most of your products are not built to support habits. It's a problem, and I'm working on that. That's what I'm passionate about. Feel free to let me know if you're also interested in this. Important that we follow the science and not the fads when it comes to understanding habit formation. While simple measures or simple models might be very tempting to rely on, we should be thoughtful when we think about this stuff. Because again, we're dealing with people's lives, we're dealing with supporting people and leading better lives. So we shouldn't overpromise, we should be very thoughtful. When it comes to fails, the 2 fails that I highlighted was consistency, that we failed to consider the context being consistent for habits to form. And we also failed to consider fails. Few solutions really thoughtfully think about how to support people when they might feel like they failed or approach some form of failed state. How do we avoid that happening? And I think that's it. So this was really fun. I think it was mentioned before, have a weekly, I have a newsletter you can check out. Also have bside.org, where there's some courses and stuff like this if you want to learn more. But all in all, I think that was it. So yeah, let's hopefully have some time for Q&As, and interested to hear what you think. If you want to have separate time to talk about some of these things, you can use this link, calendly.com/Salzer, to book a virtual coffee and keep the conversation there as well. But yeah, over to some maybe Q&A.
Samuel, Will speaking. Thank you so much. It was a fascinating talk. We really appreciate you spending the time with us. We'll open to questions now. I'm going to pass, Krishna's got his hand up, so we'll pass to you, Krishna, for the first question. Before we do, we just noticed a few people joined late, so we have recorded the session and we can share that afterwards. Samuel has also very kindly put some nice links throughout the presentation, so if you want to do some further reading, I noticed the links are there. Samuel also very generously going to share the slides after the session. And if you haven't checked out Samuel's newsletter, it's the best of its kind. So I strongly encourage you to check it out. But thanks so much again, Samuel, and Krishna, you've got the first question. Just make sure you've got your mic on there, Krishna.
Or type your question in the chat, Krishna, because sometimes it's hard to get people to talk as well.
Just while Krishna does, Samuel, a quick question from me. So you shared some research around a lot of the apps that are trying to develop habits, and it looks like some mixed results there. What is the one thing that apps could do better to build habits, or are we relying too much on the screen to build habits? Is there more to it than that? You mentioned context, environment, timing. What is it beyond the screen that we need to be thinking about, or what can these apps be doing better?
Yes, I think a useful concept from Doconomy is something called small versus big E engagement. So you have small E engagement, which happens within the app, and you have big E engagement is any behavior happening outside of the app. And so I think there's still a little bit too much maybe focus on these in-app behaviors because they're easy to measure and so on. And so it's easier to see maybe that certain things happens within the app. But as you allude to, it's really in the real world where a lot of these behaviors happen. And so I think a starting point for many apps is honestly better understanding that and tracking that as a big first step. That's often partly what I help usually do initially because it can be a little bit messy. But that's oftentimes something I see that people really set themselves blind on, these like vanity metrics that are these in-app engagement things, but maybe not so much looking at the more real-world engagement. And I think you had a couple of different questions within that question. The first thing in terms of like, what is a thing that I think most apps could benefit from? It is honestly supporting people with both developing some form of a very, very simple action plan, like making really clear like what action they're supposed to do, and then making really clear when and where and so on to do it. So like even that's just defining the action and then plugging that into a calendar, for example. It doesn't have to be filling in like a habit statement. It can be used one way where they get a clear sense of what to do, where to do it, and so on. I think that's in itself really, really underrated. And then beyond that, supporting people, as I mentioned, when it comes to failure states with coping plans, like how do we mitigate where we know we're going to struggle? You know, is there certain times where we know we're going to find it hard to do our intended behavior? Can apps in advance of that support people in maybe identifying those things and have a plan in kind of a hand for how to deal when they're tired or the weather is bad and so on? So I think that's two pretty low-hanging fruits. Yeah. I think you're muted, by the way. No.
Apologies. We've got another question in the chat here. I'll just bring it up. Thanks, Samuel. Insightful talk as usual. How do you apply that flexibility in your routines, as Katie Milkman talks about in her book?
Yeah, so I would think about it as frame it a little bit differently. So the most oftentimes important thing, if really habit is the goal, like it's completely fine to do things that are not habitual, right? It's okay it doesn't have to be always the habit being the goal. But if habit is the goal, and we really care about that, we know that consistency is important. However, what allows for more flexibility is how you engage with the behavior at that time in some way. So, for example, there's some data that I've done through work that suggests that if you prompt people to have a clear time when they're, for example, exercising and being really prepared and knowing, like, I'm exercising on Wednesdays after work, it doesn't really always matter exactly that they always do the same exercise. Maybe sometimes they go to the gym, sometimes they go for a run, sometimes do something different. It's probably not going to be as effective in terms of adding variability might lead it to becoming less automatic, but still just having that kind of general thing of like, okay, I know that at this time or this place, I'm going to do something. And then just knowing that, okay, for example, in the case of Duolingo, maybe at least I know I'm going to open the app, but then it's a little bit up to me if I'm going to start a lesson on Spanish that is an audio lesson or a written lesson or a conversation lesson and so on. So that's how I would think about flexibility. It's less maybe about, I wouldn't be flexible in the sense of like randomly doing behavior at different times of the day. That's going to be very ineffective, as I alluded to. But if you have that kind of clear sense of when and where to do something, you can then add a little more flexibility of how you do it during that time. Especially when it comes to exercise, we know that it becomes boring if you do the same thing over and over again. So we might have to actually do it more with variable exercises or things that makes it more fun to do instead of doing the same elliptical every time. Yeah.
Nice. David's got his hand up. Did you want to call it out, David?
Yeah, thanks, Will. Hey, Sam. See if I can get my camera on here. Maybe not. Yeah, great talk. Thanks, as usual, very insightful. My question was about when to focus on habits. So let's say we're moving towards this space where we're getting much better at understanding the conditions under which habit formation takes place. And I suppose the question I have is there a sense of when we should be focusing on building a habit versus other things like conscious consistency or rituals or deliberate routines? What are the spaces in which habit formation as a goal should be a priority?
Yeah, I love this question. This is actually something I think a lot about. I don't know if I have a completely formulated answer to it, but the gist, what I think you're alluding to there as well, which I think is an important takeaway here, is that I am in no way saying that habits is the panacea. And I think that's somewhat the problem, and kind of what you're alluding to as well, is that we have this idea that when we're thinking about long-term behavior change, that habit always has to be part of that equation. And I honestly don't think that has to be the case. And I would say that personally, what my experience suggests is that when it comes to these more complex behaviors, like exercising, I think sometimes having too much of a rigid habit focus might be misplaced. It might be more effective to, as you mentioned, focus a little more on the idea of ritual, for example, like make it more meaningful. So maybe it's not as automatic, and maybe you can sprinkle in some components of making, exercise consistent and doing your workouts on the same time every day, for example. That adds a little bit of sprinkle of habit, but spending more time in designing for like this kind of ritual aspect to like making that more meaningful, or more maybe the reward aspect to kind of have a variability. As a lot of people go to workout classes where they have this fitness instructor specifically designing a routine that's going to be as rewarding and positively challenging as possible. So the fitness instructor doesn't really care about whether it becomes a habit. They're there to, if you're a Peloton instructor, they're there to help the people there to make that a fun, exciting experience. And so that's what I'm currently, like in a very basic sense, leaning closer to simple things, to thinking more actively how to design habits, but more complex behaviors, thinking maybe that habits can be part of that equation, maybe as a kind of a launching off point, but then we have to expand much more to think about other areas where perhaps, thinking more about the ritual aspect that can be more impactful to getting it to stick. So that's my current answer. I don't know what you think.
Cool, thanks, Sam. No, that was great. Yeah, it's one of those areas too where I don't have a clear conclusion in my mind, but it feels like it's there are definitely situations where it's like the overarching tool, but always good to remember that it isn't necessarily an end of itself, that it's an instrument in order to achieve some other goal, which may even have its own goals that it's trying to achieve. So it's seeing it as one tool in the toolbox. And I like your dichotomy between simple behaviors and more complex ones, where it may involve ritual or meaning or enjoyment. So yeah, thank you. Cool, great talk.
Yeah, thanks. Great question. Good seeing you.
Great, thanks, David. Great question. We're just at time. We might squeeze in one more. Got a question from Steve. I see a lot of rewards use counter-objective rewards or unhealthy rewards. For example, fast food being a reward for workout or alcohol being reward for work. How would you recommend rewarding yet not turn bad stuff to trophies or state of desire?
Yeah, so incidentally, the third common mistake that I was going to include that I didn't have time to include was actually rewards, because I see very similar things, and it creates a lot of negative, both in terms of cognitive dissonance, but also other negative outcomes when we have, rewards that might be counteracting the goal itself. My general recommendations for rewards is tricky because rewards is such a broad category. There's a lot of things that can be done. It depends a lot on the context. I think in general, there is good arguments to be said that non-monetary rewards and social rewards, for example, are likely the most effective. But if nothing else, it's really important to consider that in the best of worlds, the reward should make the behavior more enticing. So if you wanted to exercise, for example, and you want to run, a good reward would be something that makes it more fun for you to run, more enjoyable, easy for you to run, like after 10 times buying a nicer running attire or nicer running shoes or something like that. That's probably a very effective reward in the long term. An ineffective one would be to have a kebab after every run, for example, or something like this, I don't know, or pizza. So that's probably the general gist, but maybe that could be another conversation about rewards, because I think it's a really interesting subject as well.
Well, thanks a lot, Sam. We'll have to get you back to do a session on rewards, I think.
Can I, by the way, I'm hijacking something now, and I didn't tell you about this, but can I share one more thing?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Cool. A little bit surprised for anyone who stayed on, but there's actually something fun that I have to share, which is that where I started was actually at UNSW. So I started studying economics at UNSW, and that's how I got into behavioral economics, through professors smuggling me books on behavioral economics. But I got, as many people might experience, in a stage where there was no jobs in behavioral economics at the time. Like I was looking, there was nothing there, and I found myself quite depressed. And I did stupid stuff like this. I took selfies outside of Sydney with stupid signs in the background, and I was one of the worst mental states of my life. Like I was pretty low. I was working for 2 years in this consultancy place and didn't really enjoy it. But then what happened? Sydney BE meetup happened. And I don't know if you know this, Will, and it's pretty fun actually, because as I was looking through this, I found that this is one of the talks I attended where you talk about cucumbers, blood, and umbrellas. I don't really remember now what you said. But this is quite interesting to see. And so I just want to say that I was actually one of those people standing at the back of these meetups at the Occidental Hotel, like feeling like an imposter, not really sure how to talk about some of these things, how to really navigate this kind of exciting field. But I felt so happy that I finally find some like peers that were talking about some of these things, talking about it in a very thoughtful, nuanced way. And, I would honestly say that BA meetups from Sydney has a lot to do with like me deciding to keep at it and eventually obviously do what I've done today. So just as a fun fact, I was there in 2015 in June and whatnot, and yeah, that's why I said yes today, because I normally don't do many talks, but I thought the least I could do is to give a little bit of a, thank you in a way of doing this talk. So thanks so much.
Wow. Thank you so much, Sam. That's really means a lot. That was a really nice shout out. Thank you. I was trying to look at the date on that slide. Was that like, how many years ago was that?
8 years ago. Yeah.
Wow. Well, I'll have to try and dust off that presentation, find it. I'm sure it's in my folders somewhere. And we'd love to get you to the Occidental pub sometime. That was quite the venue.
It was, yes.
But no, that's really lovely touch, mate. Thank you so much. And what an amazing talk. It's having followed your work. I'm sure a lot of people on the call have been following your work, and you're certainly now a leader in the space. So thank you very much. Really appreciate the fantastic talk. As I said, the talk is recorded. We're going to send around the slides. Sam's very generously shared his contact details. So thank you so much, Samuel. Fantastic talk, and keep up the great work. Thank you to everyone who's joined over the years. In fact, the Behavioral Science Network meetup. We'll announce our next speaker shortly. And just before we go, a really big thank you to our sponsors at University of Technology, Sydney. We couldn't do it without you. And thanks, Aaron, for hosting tonight. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thanks
a
so
lot,
much.
Sam.
Really good seeing you. Thank you.
Thanks,
See you
everyone.
guys.
Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Sam.